There we go. I've been tasked with basically introducing 75% of the planet's animal species. So we're going to cover invertebrates and the relationships that many of these invertebrates and insects have with plants, and how through the many millions of years, they've had a tremendous impact on the diversity of plants that we see. And not only in the diversity of flowers, because we oftentimes think of insect plant relationships as being pollination, but insects are also responsible for the aromatics, the smells, many of the flavors, and even the toxicity in plants, because their relationship goes back well over 150 million years. So with that said, I am going to get into some of the different groups of arthropods that we encounter on a regular basis in our gardens, many of which do have an impact on our plants, both positive and negative, as well as many that are just incidentals. And when people encounter them, they kind of wonder, why is this bug in my garden? So we'll cover a lot of different invertebrates and what they're doing in those systems. And hopefully, after it's all said and done, you'll have a better appreciation and recognition for many of the insects and other invertebrates, creepy crawlies, that we encounter when we're working in our gardens and yards. Insects and arthropods in general, they go back nearly 500 million years, so a little over 500 million years, to give you an idea of how old they are. One of the questions I'm often asked, how important are these invertebrates, insects, arthropods? What good is it? Again, the number of species should be evident. There wouldn't be that many species of these things if they weren't doing crucial interactions with the environment. They form a tremendous base for the importance of the species, other species of plants and animals with which we interact on a daily basis. Like I mentioned, 60 to 70% of all described species on planet Earth are arthropods. 1 in 5 species of living things on Earth is a beetle. To give you perspective of how important are beetles, 20% of all described species on planet Earth are beetles. 1/4 of all animal species are beetles. There are more species of beetles than there are species of vascular plants. So put that in perspective. Ferns, ginkgophytes, cycadophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms, all of those species combined, there are still more species of described beetles. Here in this picture, we have kind of a nice little assortment of some of the native species and introduced species, the Chinese mantis in the bottom right-hand corner being an introduction of insects that we encounter here in North Carolina. And lots of shapes, lots of colors, lots of sizes, and lots of diversity. For me, insects are like flowers in that they're very colorful. They are interesting in their shapes and forms, and I have always grown up with an appreciation for them. You might ask, why am I showing a horseshoe crab? Well, we're going to start out with when plants colonized the land, the arthropods were among the first significant animals to follow them. The horseshoe crab is related to another group of arthropods that we often encounter in our gardens, and these are the arachnids. Scorpions. There is a native species of scorpion here in North Carolina, found in the western part of our state, and occasionally people working in their yards and gardens do encounter them. In addition to our native scorpion, there have been a few introductions that are incidental. They haven't really established in our state. But just to give you a heads up, for those of us who garden, we oftentimes get plants, we oftentimes get mulch, we get other supplies, and scorpions can be incidental critters that will kind of ride in on these resources that we bring into our state. So every once in a rare while, people will encounter scorpions in their gardens or in their mulch, their bark, their different things that they bring in for their gardens. To kind of put your mind at ease, most of these scorpions, although painful when they sting, they're of no medical significance. A lot of people are afraid of scorpions. Scorpions are predators, meaning that they eat other invertebrates. So in many respects, they would be considered beneficial. And then we have the spiders, another group of arachnids. North Carolina has a rich diversity of spiders. And for most people, spiders are creepy, kind of scary. When we think of spiders, we think of venom. We think of what happens if it bites me. The vast majority of spiders that we have here in our state are of no medical significance. Here we have the common garden spider, Argyropia aurantia, and this is a common sight, particularly late summer into fall when the spiders mature. They overwinter in an egg sac. They hatch as immature as babies, and over the course of the spring and summer, they grow. Here we have a photograph or a slide of a lot of different spiders that we often encounter in our gardens. There's the lynx spiders in the top left, cellar spiders, which we often find in our garages or our sheds, our workspaces, jumping spiders, which are really cool. Those are oftentimes common in our gardens, our flower gardens, where they are ambush predators. And then you have your orb weavers, which are spiders that spin webs, and they use those webs to catch insects. So again, spiders, regardless of their size or their color or how they look or even how aggressive they may seem, the vast majority of these are not medically significant, are not aggressive, and very unlikely to bite unless you were to pick them up, grab them in your hand, and hold them like this. So I tell people, when you see spiders, don't hold them like this. Just respect them from a distance. And they are doing us a favor. They are eating insects. Oftentimes we think of spiders as eating our pest insects. Spiders are predators. They eat any insect and pretty much anything they can catch. As you can see, the lynx spider on the left, it has a Palamedes swallowtail in the top left, and the other one has a bumblebee. So spiders will eat pretty much anything they can catch. Again, some pictures of spiders. You can see the chelicera or fangs in the front-facing picture of the lynx spider. These are pretty scary-looking spiders, but all in all, quite benevolent, and oftentimes they kind of hide in the inflorescence of a lot of our flowers. So when we're out there either picking flowers or going through our flowers, sometimes we encounter them and they can be quite scary, but again, not an aggressive spider. Jumping spiders, these are, I've always thought that if they were going to make a toy for children, kind of a cushy little thing, jumping spiders might be the perfect spider to do that. They have nice forward-facing eyes. Again, these are ambush predators. And for an invertebrate, they're pretty intelligent. Wolf spiders. Now, wolf spiders are these spiders we typically find in our gardens when we are raking through the mulch or when we're moving debris and we uncover them. They're large, they're fast. Most of them do not really spin a permanent web. Sometimes they'll line burrows and things like that. These are rather rapid pursuit ambush predators on other invertebrates, including spiders, insects, slugs, snails, worms, occasionally things like small lizards, snakes, and frogs. So some wolf spiders can be the size of your fingernail, and others can get to be nearly 2 to 3 inches across in leg span. And here we have a wolf spider with her babies. Wolf spider females will carry their egg case with them. When the spiderlings emerge, they will climb onto their mother's back. They will share in the mother's prey. Once they've gone through a molt cycle, they will scatter, and each individual spiderling will mature into a wolf spider and be a resident in our gardens and around our homes, where they are serving as predators on other invertebrates. For spiders that are significant and oftentimes present a concern to homeowners and gardeners are the black widows. Here in North Carolina, we have 2 native species. On the left is the northern black widow. On the underside, it has the hourglass, but the hourglass is typically divided. So it's kind of broken right here across the middle. Another distinguishing characteristic between the northern and the southern widow is the northern widow often has these bright red dots or a line that runs down the top or the dorsal part of the abdomen as opposed to just red on the venter. Black widows are medically significant, but they are not aggressive. And when you encounter them in your gardens, oftentimes we do in any sort of garden pots or things we've had stored for a period of time that we typically don't disturb because they don't like disturbance. They like dark, moist, quiet places. But when you encounter a black widow, there's no need to be concerned. These are not aggressive. They're not going to chase you. You just have to be careful and mindful when sticking your hands in your garden and where you're putting your hands. Just be mindful of them. The brown recluse, I'm including this because the brown recluse, many times people find spiders in their gardens and they are thoroughly convinced they've encountered a brown recluse. The brown recluse is native to regions west of the Appalachian Mountains, and although there are records of them occurring here in North Carolina, they are incidental introductions on, again, things like mulch, cardboard, stored materials when people move from one place to another. Brown recluse spiders like dry environments like sheds, garages, in the wild, under bark on dead trees. Put your mind at ease. Brown recluse spiders are not common in North Carolina. Rarely are they ever encountered in the yard and in the garden. These are mostly spiders that will be found in sheds and in garages and attics and dry places. The typical, what they call the fiddle shape on the carapace, that can be a diagnostic feature, but there are other spiders with very similar patterns. And again, this is not a native species to North Carolina and rarely encountered in yards and gardens. Crustaceans. These are not insects. These are relatives to the lobster, crabs, shrimp. We have the roly-poly on the right, which is introduced from Europe, and the roly-poly can roll up into a ball. The sow bugs, in contrast, many of which are native, are very similar in appearance to the roly-poly, but unlike the roly-poly, they can't really ball up into a tight little ball or sphere. These crustaceans are mostly detritivores. That means they feed on dead, organic, decaying materials. Very rarely can they present an issue with garden plants. They occasionally will chew or gnaw on buds or new growth, sometimes flowers, things like that. But for the most part, these are an arthropod that you're going to find in your mulch, in your soil, in your compost, and not so much an issue to the actual plants themselves that we're growing. And again, you can see here the roly-poly can roll up, and the sow bug typically does not. Sow bug on the left, roly-poly on the right. Crayfish. Why would I include crayfish in gardens? Well, many people have water elements in their gardens. Many people garden in areas where there are low water tables. And some crayfish species can actually present a problem for garden plants in that they are opportunistic feeders on vegetation, other invertebrates, detritus, dead things, carcasses. And where we have low-lying areas, crayfish are some species, and this is the introduced invasive Louisiana crayfish, the one that they do the boils. They can be problematic in areas where they've been introduced because they will at night or during heavy rains or wet times in the season invade our gardens and potentially eat plants. Here I've got the lobster related to crayfish. North Carolina is the only state here on the east where we have the Maine lobster in the northern part of our coast and the spiny lobster on the southern part of our coast. I've included these because these are related to the crayfish. Crabs, which are also related to the crayfish, and shrimp. Particularly here in the top left, we have the grass shrimp. So for those of you with water elements in your gardens, perhaps ponds, sometimes these freshwater shrimp will pop up in our gardens in our water elements, and they're typically brought in on substrates or plants, aquatic plants that we introduce. So occasionally people will say, I'm finding shrimp in my garden or in my water element, and I don't know where they came from. They can also be brought in by birds. So shrimp are occasionally found in water elements in gardens. Not a problem. They are detritivores, so they're not doing any harm to any of the plants. Millipedes. Millipedes are an interesting group of arthropods. They're very ancient detritivores, so we oftentimes find them in the mulch or find them when we're digging. And some millipedes have interesting smells. They can smell like cherry or have a fruity smell. And in particular, the Sigmoria and the Aphiloria on the left, they secrete small amounts of cyanide. And it's interesting because people say, oh, cyanide smells like bitter cherries. No one ever stopped to think that cherries smell like cherries because they possess cyanide. So with the relationship between invertebrates and plants, many plants have evolved toxins to deter predation. And within the rose family, that sequestering and production of cyanide is not uncommon. So some millipedes will smell like cherry. They are not dangerous to us, The amounts of cyanide they produce is very minimal, but it does make them foul tasting for things that would be predators to the millipedes. Millipedes, they shed their exoskeleton, like do all arthropods. And here on the right, bottom right, you can see where we have one that has freshly molted. And millipedes can be quite colorful. They're slow. They do not bite. They do not possess venom, and they are not dangerous to people at all. So sometimes people encounter millipedes and they're a little bit frightened by them, but they are harmless. And they are doing a benefit in our gardens because they are detritivores. So they are helping to convert organic matter into rich soils, which in turn, those rich soils have elements and compounds in them that in turn are nutritious to plants. So they are serving a function, although not pollinating, they are serving a function that benefits many plants. Centipedes. Centipedes are predators. They have one pair of legs per segment. They are fast and they scurry. They do possess venom. And in the animal kingdom, it's interesting because the venom is not introduced through fangs. It's introduced through their first pair of legs. And technically what look like fangs are very sharp toenails or tarsal claws on the first pair of legs called prehensors. Centipedes will bite. I discourage people from trying to pick them up and handle them. However, with that said, they are not medically significant, although potentially painful should you get bitten by one. But again, very beneficial in our gardens because they are predators. They eat other invertebrates, many of which are potential plant pests. And as you see, every once in a while, there'll be an image and it will have introduced. And introduced, as we go through this, is going to become a theme because many of the more problematic species of arthropods that we encounter in our homes and gardens are actually introductions and not native. Now we're going to get to the butterflies and moths. And a question that's often asked is, what is the difference between a butterfly and a moth? From a biological and taxonomic perspective, butterflies are moths. They are a group of moths that a little over 100 million years ago, maybe 120 million years ago, gave up their crepuscular nighttime activities to take advantage of the rise of the flowering plants. And like the bees and a number of other insects, they became pollinators. So for the moths that became diurnal and took advantage of your flowering plants as they first began to appear and diversify, butterflies arose from a group of moths. So when we give this dichotomy of it's a butterfly or it's a moth, in reality, they belong to one group of insects, and butterflies are a very specialized subgroup of moths. And here we have a Cecropia moth, which is one of the larger species found here in the eastern U.S. Butterflies, we all love butterflies. Most people in gardens and gardeners and naturalists love butterflies. Gardeners have a love-hate relationship with butterflies. Butterflies, as adults, are pollinators. They're colorful, they're diverse, and they have played a role in human cultures all throughout the world for many thousands of years. Larval butterflies, aka caterpillars, that's where it becomes a little dicey with many of us. Caterpillars are essentially plant predators. And although adult butterflies are pollinators, it's interesting that if you look at Lepidoptera, they're essentially plant predators. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing because they have helped shape not only floral morphology and smells, but they've also shaped the phytochemistry, the textures and foliage, and through their relationship with plants and their diversification, many of the attributes, aside from the flowers that we see in plants that we appreciate, may be directly related to the relationship of predation that the caterpillars have played a role in during the development of these plants. The giant swallowtail, this is a species that's found throughout the eastern U.S. It feeds mostly or primarily on plants in the citrus family. The black swallowtail, this is a garden familiar. Many people are very familiar with black swallowtail larvae because they feed on things like parsley and fennel, things in the carrot family. The adult butterflies are quite common in our gardens and seem to visit a number of flowers in many different families. The The black swallowtail is sexually dimorphic. This means males and females differ. The males typically have the broader yellow band, the females a much narrower or absent yellow band. And the caterpillars are quite colorful. And although many caterpillars are defoliators, defoliation is not necessarily lethal to a plant. Most plants are able to recover rather quickly and reflush. Tiger swallowtail, kind of a signature butterfly here in the eastern U.S. The larvae of these butterflies feed primarily on trees, or the foliage of trees, I should say, not the entire tree itself. Tulip poplar, magnolias, black cherry, things in the genus Prunus, and a number of other deciduous trees and shrubs. The black swallowtail has several different color forms. The black form on the right, that is a dark form of the female. There's an interesting thing about pollination with butterflies. Butterflies have large wings, large surface area. And if you look at the lily in the right picture, you'll see the stamens, how far they extend out. You'll see the same floral structures in things like rhododendrons, azaleas, which are rhododendrons. The pollen is when the butterfly is feeding on the nectar and flapping its wings, it's hitting against the anthers, which is creating this dust cloud of pollen, which adheres to the wings of the butterfly and the legs and the body. So when the butterfly visits another flower, the pollen is then transferred from the anthers to the stamen, which then facilitates the pollination or the fertilization of the flower, which in turn allows it to produce viable seeds. So not all insects that are pollinators are really carrying pollen on their legs or on their face. Some, like these butterflies that feed on flowers such as the rhododendrons and lilies, are transferring pollen on their wings. Spicebush swallowtail, these the caterpillars are occasionally encountered on plants in the Lauraceae, things like sassafras, spicebush, red bay. And people will find the caterpillars rolled up in leaves, and oftentimes it startles them because the caterpillar has these false eyes and looks somewhat like a snake or maybe even a tree frog. It's kind of hiding there in a leaf. Again, that's a predator deterrent. But they are kind of cute with their eye spots. Very impressive caterpillar. Palamedes swallowtail. This is a butterfly, the signature of the southeastern swamps and coastal plain. Very common butterfly. However, in recent years, less common. Its host plant is also in the Lauraceae. It's a laurel, the red bay. We have a Palamedes on thistle. Now, an introduced issue. This is an ambrosia beetle, and it carries a symbiotic fungus. And as many of you have probably heard, many plants in the Lauraceae are being rather heavily impacted, and including the red bay. And here in North Carolina, a number of years ago, there was a massive red bay die-off that was caused by the pathogens carried by this introduced beetle. The impact that has had has not only been on the plant, but also on the butterfly. The loss of the host plant, or significant percentage of the host plant, has produced a decline in the Palamedes swallowtail. Although still common, its numbers are not nearly what they were decades ago. So sometimes introduced insects can have not only a deleterious effect on plants, but also on the other organisms that depend on those plants. Some more swallowtails. On the right, we have the pipevine. Pipevine is a common one on Aristolochia. We find the caterpillars on Aristolochia. The zebra swallowtail on the left, although native here to North Carolina, its distribution is kind of patchy with regards to how frequently it's seen. The larval host plant are pawpaws. Here we have the red-spotted purple. It's a common butterfly in late summer and early fall. Feeds on cherry and willow as a larva. We have some other brushfoot butterflies. The Gulf fritillary is a species we often see on passifloras. The buckeye, we see it on plantago, things in the Plantagenaceae, sometimes pentas and a number of other plants. The painted lady, the larvae of those feed on different members of the Asteraceae, thistle being a favorite. The true fritillaries feed on things like viola. North Carolina is home to roughly 1/3 of the species of butterflies found in North America. So we have around 200 plus species. There's the monarch, and we're all familiar with the monarch because many of us like to put Asclepias, or milkweeds in our gardens to encourage monarchs and to facilitate their life cycle. There's also the viceroy, which is the supposed mimic of the monarch, but as it turns out, both species are somewhat distasteful and unpalatable. The viceroy feeds on salix, and salix contains acetylsalicylic acid, which is essentially like aspirin. And if you've ever eaten an aspirin, it's very bitter. They also feed on plants in the genus Prunus, the larvae do. So the butterflies often sequester toxins that are also unpalatable, kind of like the bitter cyanides from the foliage there too. So both butterflies have kind of evolved to look like each other because they're somewhat unpalatable to predators. Satyrs, these are oftentimes mistaken for moths. And as I mentioned, butterflies essentially are an offshoot of moths. There is an endangered species found in a few small isolates in the sandhills, and that's Mitchell's satyr. The yellow butterflies and whites. The cabbage white is an introduction. It came in on cabbage and members of the cabbage family. Many of these feed on legumes, like senna, things like that. So oftentimes the butterflies and the caterpillars are associated with plants in the legume family, some of them with plants in the mustard cabbage family. And just again, kind of an array of diversity. Now, these are an interesting group of butterflies, the hair streaks, the harvesters, the blues. Many of these have interesting life cycles that go above and beyond the typical relationship with plants. Some of them have weird relationships with ants. And the harvester in the middle, its caterpillar is not phytophagous. It feeds on aphids and scale insects and small bugs. So the harvester has a predatory larva, predatory caterpillar. And again, a little bit of diversity of some of the hair streaks that we have here in North Carolina. These are small butterflies, typically with a wingspan of only about an inch, oftentimes mistaken for moths because they don't display the bright colors we typically associate with butterflies. And here we have the blues. These are a common sight around mud puddles and oftentimes flitting in among our gardens. They seem to spend a lot more time around seeps and wet spots on the ground than they do flowers, but occasionally we do see them in our gardens. And again, as a pollinator, they are beneficial in that they're serving the function of successful plant reproduction. Skippers. For a long time, no one really knew what to do with skippers. Are they butterflies? Are they moths? And the answer is yes and yes. Skippers are oftentimes associated with legumes. The silver spot skipper, its caterpillars are oftentimes found on the false indigo, the baptisias. Introduced invasive, here we have the gypsy moth, and it is a spreading problem across much of the eastern U.S. It was introduced for the silk industry many years ago, decades ago, and subsequently escaped into the wild. And the USDA introduced a fly to control that moth, that insect. And in turn, although successful, this fly has had a negative impact on many of our native species, like the Luna moth, some of our Saturniids. Now, oftentimes in our gardens, we encounter large green caterpillars. We may find these green caterpillars walking across our driveways. We'll find them on sweet gum trees or miscellaneous shrubs. And many times, large green caterpillars are mistaken for the hated tomato or tobacco hornworm. Not all large green caterpillars are pests, and many of them are the immature stages of some of our most impressive species of moths. For the most part, they do very little damage. Occasionally, on small trees or small shrubs, a couple large caterpillars can eat their way through a significant percentage of foliage. But as I mentioned, defoliators typically do not have the negative impact on a plant. It's more of an aesthetic issue, and plants are pretty quick to reflush. Cecropia moth. On the bottom right, you see that large silk cocoon. Oftentimes in our gardens and on our shrubs, we encounter things like that once the plants defoliate in fall or in the winter, and the question rises, what exactly is this? Should I remove it? No, you shouldn't. These are cocoons. There are also things like egg cases to mantids and other structures. Leave them. There's no need to pull these things out or to cut them out and throw them away because they are the overwintering stages for some of our most impressive insects and invertebrates that really pose no real threat to our gardens or our homes. Here you can see the size of the Cecropia caterpillar next to my thumb, about twice as long, it's about as big around as my thumb and twice as long. The cocoons are quite large, oftentimes about the size of a golf ball. And again, silky structures like this are found on many plants. The Cecropia in gardens is often encountered on rose, forsythia, privet, a number of trees in the genus Prunus. It can be found on apple, although not a pest. A large caterpillar can eat a significant amount of foliage, but it isn't going to kill the shrub or hurt the plant. And some more pictures of some of the large moths that we have here in North Carolina. The Polyphemus, the tulip tree silk moth, which feeds almost exclusively on Liriodendron. Polyphemus moths feed on oak, maple, sycamore, prunus. Large green caterpillars found on shrubs are typically not true pests in that they are not going to do significant long-term damage to any of our garden plants. One of my favorites is the hickory horndevil on the left, royal walnut moth. It's a very impressive insect. And even above and beyond the moth with a 6-inch wingspan, the caterpillars are tremendous. They are the largest caterpillar we have in the eastern U.S. And here I have a handful of them, kind of look like baby Chinese dragons. They are harmless. They feed on a lot of different trees. Sweet gum is a favorite, and sweet gum is oftentimes viewed as a weed tree. They will feed on hickory, walnut, and a few other deciduous trees. And again, rarely do we see these large caterpillars in numbers that do any kind of significant damage to the plants. Here's an interesting one. How many of you in the fall, late summer, fall, you see the oak worms? And I mean, boy, do they strip an oak tree. They will eat almost every bit of foliage on these oaks, particularly when we get into the autumn, early autumn, late summer. And there is oftentimes a concern with their numbers and how much they eat on an oak. Here are some things to consider. Oak leaves take a very long time to degrade. They're high in tannins. These caterpillars are defoliating the tree within a matter of 2 to 6 weeks of the tree defoliating naturally. And as they consume the leaves, they are defecating the digested material and it falls to the ground and it creates a wonderful fertilizer. So in many respects, they aren't doing the damage that we perceive. They are doing us a favor, less raking and fertilization. So when you see the oak worms in late summer and fall, there's no need to get all concerned. They're doing a function. They've evolved with the oak trees, and it's a mutualistic, beneficial coexistence. Sphinx moths. These are very impressive moths that we oftentimes see visiting flowers in our gardens. They have the long proboscis, the long tongue, feeding on many of the tubular flowers, sometimes mistaken for hummingbirds because some of them are quite large. Tomato hornworm, tobacco hornworm, North Carolina state bird. The tobacco hornworm is the one we typically find on our tomatoes, although there is one called the tomato hornworm. And these guys can be quite destructive to garden plants. So this is one that when their numbers build up, they can do significant damage, particularly to herbaceous annuals and things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, anything that's in the family Solanaceae. So the larvae can be quite devastating to herbaceous plants, particularly in large numbers. Again, photographs of the diversity of sphinx moths, hawk moths. Tiger moths. Tiger moths are an impressive group. Their caterpillars have an interesting relationship with us because oftentimes we use the caterpillars to predict how our winter and our weather is going to go. How broad is the band? How dense is the fur? There are many species of tiger moths, many species of caterpillars. Each species of moth is going to have a caterpillar that is going to be a little different than the caterpillar of the next moth. However, there may be some truth to the numbers and the dynamics of the different species that we see from year to year as of climate or weather relationships. But I'm going to say for the most part, I would not plan out our severity of our winters or the mildness of our winters based on the woolly bear caterpillars that you encounter in your gardens. Beetles. Like I mentioned earlier, beetles are the most diverse group of animals on the planet. They are Unknown to most people, among the first pollinators. So the relationship of the earliest flowering plants, the magnolias, the water lilies, their relationship to beetles is really quite interesting because beetles kind of opened the door to the initial relationship that flowering plants have with insects as pollinators. And that's something most people don't think of. When we think of pollinators, we think of bees and we think of butterflies and occasionally things like flies, but rarely do we acknowledge the role and importance that many beetles have played in the relationships and the diversity of flowers that we see. White grubs. Oftentimes when people encounter grubs in their gardens, it's an immediate panic. We think that all white grubs are feeding on the roots or feeding on components of our plants that are going to damage the garden. This is the Eastern Hercules beetle. Their grubs are quite large. It's a huge grub, about half the size of a hot dog wiener. They feed on decaying organic matter, mostly wood. So when people find these in their gardens, it's usually because they've used some kind of wood chip or mulch. They're not doing any harm to the plant itself. They take the wood, they convert it into some of the richest soil that you would ever encounter. I have raised these, and that mass of grubs that you see there are some that I raised. It takes about 2 years from egg to adult beetle. And the soil they produced was phenomenal. I used it in a lot of my house plants and a lot of my potted plants, and it's an incredible soil. So again, not all beneficial insects are pollinators. Many of them are also turning the soil. They're releasing nutrients and converting organic matter into materials that plants can use. Ladybugs, wonderful predators. They eat aphids, scale insects. There's a myriad of diversity of ladybugs. However, there are also introduced ladybugs. And this slide here, you see lots of different ladybugs. Those are all one ladybug. That's one species. It has many different forms or color forms, morphs. And this ladybug has been somewhat deleterious to many of our native ladybugs. It has displaced them, and the larvae actually are competitive excluders. They'll eat other ladybug larvae and eggs. And so many of the ladybugs that we encounter now are really not our native ladybug. And although there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the color and the pattern in this particular species, we're oftentimes duped into thinking like I've got a lot of different kind of ladybugs in my garden, when in reality, you may be encountering this single Asian lady beetle and one of the many color morphs that it presents. Beetles, these are native. There's the grapevine beetle. Sometimes the adult beetles will do some defoliating or skeletonizing on the leaves of grapes, vitis. Typically not in numbers that are significant to the plant. The green June beetle or peach beetle, we see these oftentimes on fruit, particularly as the fruit becomes ripe. You'll find them on figs, you'll find them on peaches, plums, occasionally apples. Beetle, for the most part, is not a pest. They're advantageous on overripe fruit, so they will mass congregate, and sometimes that becomes a little bit annoying or disconcerting to the homeowner, particularly with regards to the fruit tree. They're just taking advantage of overripe fruit. The striped June beetle oftentimes can be found on conifers, mostly pines. And the adult beetles will eat the needles, but again, they don't exist in numbers. They're going to do any kind of noticeable or significant damage to plants, but they are oftentimes encountered in our yards, particularly where we have pines or have planted certain pines as ornamentals. Japanese beetle, introduced invasive, no surprise. These are a nuisance for almost every gardener, and there is almost no end to the diversity of plants that they will skeletonize and impose foliar damage. Fortunately, they're relatively short occurrence and mostly late May into early July, so they're not that persistent throughout the entire growing season. But when they are present, they are quite problematic. Dung beetles. Oftentimes when we see bright, shiny, metallic beetles, they are mistaken for Japanese beetles. I wanted to point out that this particular dung beetle is a very impressive jewel scarab or dung beetle. As the name implies, you can imagine what it likes to provide for its young to eat. But not all metallic beetles that we encounter in our yards or in our gardens are there to do damage to our plants. So this is not a Japanese beetle. This is a colorful dung beetle, and the males in particular have this really impressive horn. Other species of dung beetles are occasionally encountered in our gardens. And when we are out gardening and working in our yards and we find large beetles, sometimes that's alarming to people because they think that perhaps there's damage being inflicted on the roots. Not necessarily the case. These are incidental. So if you live near a farm or if you have pets or just wildlife that's doing its thing, eating, and whatever goes in one end comes out the other, these guys are the cleanup crew. They ball it up. They bury it, they lay their eggs, and their grubs do the rest of the work. And again, going back to white grubs, not all white grubs that we encounter in our gardens are deleterious to our plants. And here's a case or an example of a scarab that is actually part of the cleanup crew that gets rid of whatever other animals leave behind. And be glad they do it. Longhorn beetles, borers. Some of these can be problematic. They're quite colorful. Interestingly, many of the adults are pollinators. As larvae, they can do damage to branches or limbs on trees. The adults will bore down and lay their eggs in these. Some of them in the roots, some in the trunks, the stems, the branches. Typically for our native species, because there's a natural balance between them and the species of plants with which they have adapted and evolved, they are not considered significant problems. However, on the far left here, we have the introduced and invasive Asian longhorn beetle, very much so a problem because it is not adapted to North American plants in a balance where there is a predator-prey relationship, not only between it and the plant, but between it and the other insects with which it shares the habitat or other predators. So again, these introduced species oftentimes become a much greater threat to our homes and gardens than do the native species. And on the left, we have the Asian longhorn. On the right, we have the cottonwood longhorn beetle, which is native, not particularly common, but it does a very similar life cycle in relationship to the cottonwood, but never really in significant numbers to be a noticeable issue. Here are some beetles that we occasionally find on milkweed. When we plant milkweed for monarchs, we get the chrysomelid, the milkweed leaf beetle, and we also get the milkweed longhorn beetle, both of which will eat the foliage, the flowers, the stems of the milkweed plant. And you'll notice that they also are orange and black, red and black, not too much unlike the monarch. These are color combinations that in nature tell things like lizards and birds, your visual predators, that I'm not going to taste very good. So move forward at your own risk. You're probably going to take a bite. You're going to spit me out. But not unlike the monarch, they sequester the toxins from the plant. Typically, they don't exist in numbers that are that problematic. I have seen situations in which the milkweed leaf beetle has done a pretty good job defoliating milkweed. So if you're looking to have milkweed in your garden for the monarchs, these are a couple of the beetles you might want to watch out for. Again, I would not recommend spraying because that's going to have a deleterious effect on your monarchs, but they can be picked off and removed and kind of tossed out of the way. Flathead wood borers, we've got the ash borer, and we have natives. And again, a lot of this is about recognizing some of our natives versus some of our introduced invasives. Not all of the beetles or insects. My biggest concern is a lot of times people mistake our native species for pests. So I'm going to flip through some of these quick. Here are the click beetles, lightning bugs. They are beneficial predators throughout our gardens and our yards as both adults and immatures. The lacewings, the mantis flies, also predators. These are beneficial insects. Wasps, for the most part, beneficial insects. Even things like hornets, yellow jackets, and paper wasps, they are predators on many insect pests. We do have the invasive European hornet. I would like to point out the cicada killer, bottom and left. This is not an Asian murder hornet. These are the largest wasp we have here in the East. Sometimes the females can approach 2 inches in length. When you see these cicada killers, they are not murder hornets. There's no need to fear. There's the velvet ant, a wingless wasp. We have bees, many species of bees. I love honeybees. Honeybees are not native to the Americas. They were brought here from the old world. They are wonderful agricultural elements to fruit trees and pollination. They are not necessarily, however, ecologically beneficial. They can have detrimental impacts on native plants as well as native pollinators, in that they can exclude native pollinators. They also are not necessarily effective pollinators of many of our native plants. So although they feed on the nectar and the pollen, they are not necessarily accomplishing the reproductive necessities for many of our native plants. Ants. We're all familiar with the red imported fire ant, which can be problematic. Here's the native Carolina mantis. Its relationship with hummingbirds is perfectly fine because it's a small species. Here is our introduced Asian mantis. They can reach lengths of 4 to 6 inches long. Not such a beneficial relationship with the hummingbird. The Chinese mantis is known to be able to catch and eat hummingbirds, small lizards, small snakes, and even small turtles. Grasshoppers and crickets, many species. Cicadas, many species. Not significantly damaging to most of our plants. Sometimes when the periodicals emerge, they can cause what's flagging. The oviposition in the tips of the plants can give the appearance of a lot of damage. The trees grow out of this. It's kind of a natural pruning every 17 years or 13 years. Leafhoppers, kind of like the mosquitoes of the botanical world. Some of them are responsible for the transmission of diseases. Aphids and scale insects, oftentimes a scourge among botanists and horticulturalists. However, they have played a role in shaping the survivability of many of our plants. Ants oftentimes tend to scale insects, and ants can oftentimes move scale insects from one plant to another, and people don't realize that. They will take the crawler or immature stage, and then they will seed them on another plant because they like to harvest the honeydew or the sugary excretions produced by the scale insects. Stink bugs, assassin bugs, some of these have beneficial relationships in that they're predatory. Others can be somewhat deleterious on plants. Water bugs, oftentimes encountered in our water elements. The vast majority of these are predatory, and many of them are capable of inflicting a painful bite. So when you find water bugs, it's best to just leave them alone and realize they are doing a beneficial role in our water elements in our gardens. Dragonflies, mosquito hawks, also beneficial. Mayflies, an incidental. If you have water elements or live near water, you may encounter these. They're not doing anything to your plants, positive or negative. Snails, we do have the European snail that has been introduced in the eastern part of our state. They can be quite damaging. The leopard slug can be quite damaging, although not insects. I thought I would include them here. And which bugs creep us out the most? Those are the ones that live with us and on us. And actually, with that said, I am going to open up the floor at this point and kind of end the slideshow. And I am open to sharing a couple things I have with me. I raised the Cecropia moth. I've been doing it now since 1997. This is a native moth. I raised them here in the house. So every once in a rare while, I'll have one of these 5-inch caterpillars, I guess, wander off and spin a cocoon somewhere in the house. And then in the middle of the winter, when we have snow instead of a sunny, warm spring day, the adult moth will emerge. Sad for the moth. There's nowhere to go and nothing to do, but I'm going to show it to you. This is a Cecropia moth. This is a living individual that was flying around the living room the other day and had my younger dog, my little 3-year-old dog, very interested in what was going on behind the couch. So I got to looking behind the couch and there was a large moth. So this is a Cecropia moth. And yes, he is alive. They don't have mouth parts. So the Cecropia moth is not going to starve to death in the sense of no food. It will starve to death because it has no functional mouth parts. I do want to show a couple wasps, and there's one in particular. Let me see if I can find the right tray here. This is an interesting little wasp that we see in late summer. I don't know that that's really going to be a good, no, it's not showing it. There we go. You can see a little bit of the red and yellow at the end. This is a scoliid wasp, and in late summer and in fall, they're very common on a lot of the asteraceous plants like goldenrod, and in fact, a lot of different flowers, and you'll see them in mass number. This is a native wasp, and one of the things I really like about it is they are predatory on the white grubs of things like the Japanese beetle. And so when we see these in large numbers, it means there is a nice reservoir of food for it, for its life cycle, for its young. And this particular scoliid wasp does go after a number of scarab beetle grubs, particularly those in the Rudolini and the Cetonini, which are oftentimes garden problems. Show you a few more wasps right here. And it really is more effective when I can show you in person. Here's a cicada killer, large wasp, not a murder hornet. Remember, here in North Carolina, eastern U.S., the Asian hornet really was only recorded as a single incident in the Pacific Northwest. I think that the news and social media ran wild with that, much to the dismay of many of us who like our native species, and found that there was a lot of destruction to native wasps that were being mistaken for the so-called murder hornet. Here we have a potter wasp in the little mud structures that it makes for its larvae, and oftentimes it stuffs things in there like caterpillars or larvae of other insects. There are many different species of potter wasps. Many of them have different prey items that they feed their young, and even things like here are paper wasps. Now, they're not real recognizable with their wings closed. Maybe that's a little more recognizable. Paper wasps are oftentimes kind of maligned because we get stung and they come across as being aggressive. But think of a queen paper wasp as a single mother raising a bunch of daughters that in turn are helping her raise other daughters. And the adults are predatory. They go after many insects in our gardens. They're not only pollinators as adults, but they're also predators. And then they in turn take the insects that they kill and chew up, and then they feed to their larvae. So for the most part with paper wasps, I kind of go by the leave them alone. If you know they're there, there's no need to get rid of them unless they're in an immediate spot that poses a potential problem for you and your family members. Just show you one last thing. There's a Cecropia cocoon. You can see how large that is. And this particular Cecropia cocoon was a wild one that I found. I've been raising them for so long, and because they are native, I turned them loose, and now I can drive through my neighborhood, and almost every little shrub or tree, I'll find one or two, which is kind of wonderful because when I first moved here, they weren't as common as they are now. So kind of like Johnny Appleseed, I have reestablished Cecropias in a lot of parts of Wake and Johnston County. So with that said, I'm going to turn the program back over to the rest of the staff. So thank you. I appreciate your time today.